Okay, this is the interview with Ruth Hawley, almost 92 years old. She's the granddaughter of William Allhand Lynch, and today she's going to talk about his second oldest daughter, Carrie Linch. So, what can you tell me about Carrie Linch?
Well, she was a tiny, petite person. She could stretch to be 5 foot tall, very short, and a very uh, nice personality and very likable. And she was nice looking. But when I knew her, she had gray hair and typical bun in the back, and was a farm wife. And she was married to a man called Ben Appleman. And Ben had one brother, Charlie, who was a bachelor, and he made his home with them. So he lived with them well, until in later years, he committed suicide. And but they were a very compatible family. And Carrie had two children. The first one was a son called Clifford, and a daughter called Gladys. Well, Clifford, they were both eccentric people. And Clifford, for some strange reason, he decided he liked the excitement of crime and seeing how he could get by with any kind of a thing that'd pop into his head. And I remember Aunt Carrie laughing over Clifford when he was about maybe he possibly wasn't even 12 years old. When they had gone left him on the farm alone, he loaded up, I believe it was several hogs in the back of the old truck. It might have even been a a horse and wagon. I'm not sure, but he took those hogs in and he sold them. To the man at there at the place there in Alvo that bought them. Well, places chastising him and giving him a good swat and punishing him. They laughed at it. Aunt Carrie thought that was the cutest thing she ever heard of, him being that smart to pull that off for his spending money. Well, anyway, he had that tendency, and but then when he was a young guy, uh, he got married to a girl named Ruth, and she was as nice a person as you'd ever want to know, a lovely, beautiful woman, and Clifford was a nice appearing, smart, attractive person, and very personable that everyone thought highly of him, but he had that tendency to be, well, just be crooked. And he spent his whole life until he got out of the penitentiary how he could do something that he shouldn't be uh, involved in.
What did he go to the penitentiary for?
Writing bad checks. That was his long suit.
And
And
how long was he in there for?
oh, a couple of years. That was there in Lincoln. But everybody liked Clifford, and Aunt Carrie just went into hysterics when he finally uh, got sentenced to go to the penitentiary there in Lincoln, and there was a family friend or maybe a distant relative said, "No, Aunt Carrie, you can't save him this time because he'd already cost them several farms in clearing his debts of writing bad checks." And Uncle Ben was heading for the poor farm with him, and Aunt Carrie was just when it come to Clifford, she had no good common sense at all. And finally, when he went off to the penitentiary, Ruth did get a divorce from him, and he was a single person. But he he had this. It was absolutely no reason for it because he was a pampered, spoiled, uh, and he. I think it was two farms that Uncle Ben, due to Aunt Carrie's wailing and carrying on, that he to keep him out of the pen, and that's what this. family relative of some sort that was connected with the legal people there in Nebraska, and he said, "No, Aunt Carrie, we're not going to let him go because you're going to end up destitute with him. And we're not going to allow it because he just has pushed it too many years and too far."
Did he change his life around after he was in the
Well,
penitentiary?
he met a lady called, oh dear, I can't think of it offhand, but he did meet a very ordinary, common girl who was a nice enough person, but she didn't come from any kind of anywhere near his level. But she was who he picked up with, and he married her. And then they had one child called Joanne. Well, him being the father of Joanne, and of course he fell in love with this beautiful little girl, and he was had a turnabout from his wayward naughtiness. And it was also unnecessary because if he had had his knuckles wrapped in the beginning, it could have been easily stopped. But because he wasn't a mean person, he was very, very personable and well liked, and and it was just a game with him to do this kind of stuff. Well, he married, I can't think of her name offhand, but she was a local gal that was one of the little towns around there that he picked up with, and she was years younger than he was. This went on until he was a middle-aged man. Then he marries, what did I say her name was?
You forgot her name.
Well, it'll come to me. Uh, and so
So going back to Aunt Carrie.
So Aunt Carrie had little Joanne as her. Oh my goodness, she just was beside herself. She was so tickled over that grandchild that Clifford had married this gal and had this. And I remember when you joined the Job stuff. I forget. Well, anyhow, she was a very bright child, very smart. Well, Clifford was as smart as they come, and she was the apple of everybody's eye. Aunt Carrie was just beside herself when she came on the scene.
So Aunt Carrie was alive. You remember Aunt
yeah.
Carrie?
Yeah.
And what kind of person was she?
Very, very charming and very likable, and so was Belle. All the family had personality, and were self-educated because they all went to country school, and they went long enough to learn to read and write and to figure. Grandpa did have that kind of ambition for his children, that they all learned, but it was taught in the local country school, and yeah, they only went to school in the wintertime after the crops were in, and only for 3 or 4 months. And then the age made no difference when they went, but just so they accomplished that being uh, literate. And they were. They were very smart, capable people due to that country school training.
Mm-hmm.
And
so, do you have any other memories of Carrie?
well, she took care of Charlie, the brother-in-law. He had his room up there in the upstairs of their big house, and I used to go up into that room where their Aunt Carrie's trunk was there, and I spent many an hour playing with all of these keepsake old-fashioned clothing that was in that trunk. And Uncle Charlie's aunt bedroom had this little extra walk-in. Was about the size of a double-sized closet, but it was a trunk room, and Clifford had his paraphernalia for opium pipe was in there, and all of the clothing was kept. And Christine, their daughter that they raised, who was really the brother's daughter, that was Sam. It was his daughter they took in when her mama died, and they raised her as their own. So in reality, they had really the 3 children, the 2 of their own, and then one of Sam Lynch's children by one of his wives. And Christine was the joy of their life, and Uncle Ben, he adored Christine, and because she brought nothing but joy to his life, where the others, uh, well, Gladys was all right, but she was full of ginger, and she went off and she joined the theater work in Hollywood. She went to Hollywood and was in the among the she played in the with that uh, famous director. She was in his shows uh, and traveled with the troupe. So she was a professional actress. That was Gladys. And I'm trying to remember, but it will come
Was
to
that
me.
Gladys Traherne?
Gladys Traherne. She traveled. She was a proper, bona fide uh, actress, and her manager or her instructor was one of the top directors of all times in Hollywood. Well, in that period of her life, she met this Al Traherne, who was connected with the theatrical group. He was a promoter, and she married this Al Traherne, and he turned out to be a will o' the whisk, the will o' the whisk. He was not one that you, but he was an older man, and she had quite a career for her in the early days of Charlie Chaplin and that crowd.
So she was a silent movie star.
A silent movie, and she had this top producer. He was the head big. I can't think of his. They'd have to check it out. Uh, his his wife. Well, I think the first week or so they were married, he took off, and he had a had enough of married life. But he came back after a while, and no, like it or he didn't care whether she liked it or not.
So then Gladys was your cousin.
Yeah, that was Aunt Carrie. Gladys would be my dad's half sister's daughter.
So she's your half cousin.
There's a lot of stories about Gladys and her life.
We'll come back.
Yeah,
with
well,
Gladys.
I'll have to have time to think on all that.
You can think about that. We'll come back to Gladys. So I think this is.
I was trying to think of the famous director. I believe he was killed on the Titanic.
Okay.
That. It'll come to me.
Okay, well, we'll come back to Gladys on a different.
But she was well established in Hollywood.
Okay. But we'll do another interview about Gladys, because this is all we have to say about Aunt Carrie. So we'll come back to Aunt Carrie later if we think of anything else. But for now,
I guess I told you about Charlie committing suicide.
No. Why did you tell me about that?
That was Aunt Carrie's brother-in-law.
Okay, her husband's brother.
Yeah, and he was a loner, and he had his own car, and he lived there, and he worked as in partnerships. Uncle Ben wouldn't have it any other way, that he got his fair share of money, which he periodically would go off to Omaha and have a binge and come home head hanging. And
he was an alcoholic or just a party boy?
He was a party boy, and he came home broke, in bad trouble. Bad health and everything else followed after him. And then he eventually took a gun, went out on their front porch and shot his top of his head off.
Oh, dear.
How
old was he when that happened?
Oh, I suppose 60, 55, 60, not very old. And
who
very nice person, and soft-spoken gentleman. You couldn't ask for a nicer person. He was a very kind-hearted, good man. Mm-hmm. Well, Uncle Ben was the same way. And Uncle Ben looked after him and gave him his home to live in, and kept him when he had enough money, whatever was. I'm sure it was done very generously, his spending money and things like that. But he worked around the farm, and I remember he was out if he needed field work or fed the hogs, and that was the time, one summer's time we were there, and I was about 6, and Uncle Charlie was out in the feed lot with a bucket of corn or something, and I was up in the corn crib, Well, there was an old sow there with a bunch of piglets with her, and I started to get down, and she let on as if she noticed me, and I knew enough to be afraid. And Uncle Charlie, Aunt Carrie was calling for me to come in for dinner, and Uncle Charlie had his hands full of hog feed, and he had these two buckets in his hand, and he called to me, "Come on, she won't hurt you. She won't hurt you. Come on," because he didn't want to stop what he was doing to escort me out of danger. So I learned my lesson. You don't always listen to just because they're older people that you mind. Because I instinctively knew that hog had it in for me, the old mother hog. Well, sure enough, I crawled out, and here she came at me with her mouth wide open, and I made a run for it to the where Uncle Charlie was at. He was between me and the fence into the house entrance, and I could remember looking over my shoulder, and she was about 10 feet behind me with her mouth stretched wide open. And I'll never forget that as long as I live. Was that I literally flew. My little feet and legs just took off uh, and Uncle Charlie, in the meantime, dropped his bucket. He was old, but at least he acted old. And he dropped a bucket and started hollering and whoo, 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 to get her attention. Well, I was going to be killed. That's all there was to it. But I ran fast enough, and by his clanging and yelling, got her called off. But I came that close to getting killed. I'll never forget that as long as I live. And we had wonderful times at Aunt Carrie's home, and we'd make it at least every summer we'd go down there. And that one summer, that was when the widow or the wife of Lawrence, uh, that would be Kiefer, her and her two kids, we all met there at Uncle Ben's. Her daughter Marguerite, who we kept in contact in up until just later years, that lived here in Encinitas. Marguerite was a young girl at that time, about 12, and her brother Jack. They made it by train that far because Lenore had asthma or something, and she couldn't stand the climate. Some silly that she had to get out of Detroit, where Lawrence had his job at the Ford Motor Company, and he was making good living. Well, they were going to head for California and have a rental out there. It was easy done in those days. There in Glendale, I believe it was. So now I'm off the track. What I'm talking about?
Having a good time at Aunt Carrie's house.
Oh yeah, at Aunt Carrie. So we had Jack had their old Model T Ford that he drove that came from the Ford Company, and he was just 16 years old, and he made that trip by himself. And then I believe he drove the two women, that'd be Marguerite, his sister, and his mother, on to California. With that
could you give their last names as well?
That would be Kiefer.
Marguerite Kiefer.
Yeah. Lawrence Kiefer.
And Lawrence Kiefer.
See, his father was Lawrence. And now Carl Kiefer was the one that lived in California when we moved out there. And we had Dorothy and Virginia were their two daughters.
Let's go back to Carrie, Aunt Carrie.
Aunt Carrie. Anyway, they had a parrot called Polly. And Polly was not trustworthy with anybody but Uncle Ben. And she just was the biggest performer you ever saw for a bird. And he adored that parrot. And he was always playing with her and talking to her. And she'd call him Papa, Papa. And she was a cooing and a loving over him. But anybody else, look out. She'd bite him. So, anyway, Polly was the light of his life. He played with her every day, and he just was smitten with her. Well, one day he had her, and he put her up for some reason on top of the wash machine on the outside porch where it was open to the cats and dogs. And in a moment, we had to go into town, so we started out in the old Model T Ford he had, a coupe, and we got down almost, well, it was about in front of the house because we came out of the barnyard and we were driving along, and I said, "Oh, Uncle Ben, Polly." Oh, my goodness. He'd forgotten that he'd left Polly out on the wash machine. And so he almost upset the car, turning it around to get back so he could go in the driveway and rescue Polly from being eaten up by the cats. There was a place full of cats. But Polly was safe. She'd crawled up, but the cat, it happened, it wasn't that much time had passed, maybe 10 minutes or so, that they hadn't really picked up on the fact that she was on the loose, or she would have been killed. And so he rescued Polly and took her in the house, put her in her cage, and then we took off. That was some excitement, though. I think Polly almost got herself killed.
Okay, well, let's stop here. We'll come back to Carrie later if we think of anything. So this is the end of the this is the end of the interview right now with Carrie.
Clifford ended up in prison, and he married a woman by the name of